Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So if you have a home lab, one of the most important things is to be able to remote control or remote manage your systems. And also, it seems that it's important to be able to support remote users from time to time. So Remotely is another open source, self-hosted alternative to Teamviewer. And we covered Rustdesk the other day, so Remotely is another option. So Remotely has what they call portable or instant clients, and they also have resident client programs for Windows and Linux, and then they have a resident agent for macOS, but they don't have a portable or instant client. Basically, what the difference is that your instant client is something that someone downloads. They don't really have to install it. It can run directly on their system, and you can connect to them to remote control them. Whereas a resident agent is something that installs on the system, sits there latently, and then you can connect to it anytime you need to remotely manage that particular system. So that might be better for organizations to have a resident agent installed. So Remotely is designed for both remote assistance and remote control. So Remotely is a web-based application that only requires hosting over reverse proxy. And you'll recall on my last video where we talked about Rustdesk, it had a requirement to open 4 or actually 5 ports for port forwarding down to the server. Since Remotely is a web-based application, it only uses ports 80 and 443, and we set up a remote proxy such as Nginx Proxy Manager in order to be able to host it on the web so people can access it remotely. So the client program interface for Remotely looks a lot like Teamviewer. We covered Teamviewer the other day, except this one doesn't look as much like Teamviewer as does Rustdesk. Instead, it's very, very simple. It simply has an option to enter your name as the person that's going to remote control the remote client, and then it has a session ID. So the intent of this program overall is that it's designed only for the administrator of the server or the authorized user of the server to be able to remote control someone, whereas both Rustdesk and Teamviewer can initiate a remote control from either direction. Here's the GitHub page for Remotely, which at this point is now maintained by a group called Immense, and it is described as a remote control and remote scripting solution built with .NET 7, Blazor, and Signal-R. The way that Remotely is designed to be used is that you have your remote user visit your Remotely site. In my particular case, this is remotely.scotti-byte.com. Then you direct them to the downloads page, and on the downloads page, they have an option to download a portable instant support client either for Windows or for Linux. The resident agents that are listed here are not downloadable unless you're actually signed in as a Remotely administrator or a Remotely user. All other operations require you to log into the Remotely session. So if I click on remote control here, it will ask us to log in. But let's go ahead and go back to this main screen, click on the login option, and here I have an option to log in. And so I'm going to log in with my Bitwarden, tell it to log in, and it also has the option to support two-factor authentication, and I'm a real fan of two-factor authentication. Now, once you're logged in, you can see that your menu is greatly expanded in that you have a home session or home screen, and it lists devices. If I had resident devices that I had added here because I had installed the resident client, they would be listed as devices that I would be able to remote control. As it turns out, I haven't used remotely for that specifically because I usually use it for one-off sessions to support remote users. Next, we have the remote control window. When you click on it, you simply are going to connect to a remote client. They've already downloaded a client, and so therefore you're going to type in their session ID. This screen is only used for those instant support sessions, and it would not be used in the cases where a resident client already exists out here, because you would be able to control them from the screen that you're seeing here. On the remote control tab, once we're logged in, this is where we get the remote session ID from the remote user in order to control them for the portable instant support clients. Going back to the main screen, the next thing that we have to look at here is the downloads menu. And in the downloads menu, we have the option now as a logged in user, not only to download the portable instant support clients, but this is where we can also download the resident clients for Windows, Linux, and also macOS here at the bottom. And so the resident clients are used for only authorized users, because those are the only people that can connect to the resident clients once they're installed. The next section is labeled scripts, and this is also only for people that are on a resident client. What it does is it gives you the ability to execute various kinds of shell scripts on the remote systems in order to perform maintenance on those particular systems. I'm going to go ahead and skip over the device details and user options and head directly over to the organization screen, which is the first option under the admin options. Here's where you can go ahead and create device groups, and you can also create additional users, and users can fall within device groups, and then device groups can manage particular workstations in those groups. Next, under the admin, we have the option to specify your particular branding, and you can change the logo, icons, and that sort of thing. And then you have the option for API keys. API keys will allow you to obtain certain information remotely. Then we have the server logs here telling you how remotely is running. And then finally, we have the server configuration section, and you can go down and do various settings on it. And then we have the settings for my particular account, and this will give you your profile settings. You can have your username, and you can have your email address. You can have your password, two-factor authentication, and other personal type of data. Here we are logged into a Windows desktop for Windows 11. I'm going to make believe that I'm a remote user that needs support, so I've gone to remotely.scotti-BYTE.com. On this page, if I direct the user to click on the download section, they have the option to download the Windows 64-bit client. So I'm going to go ahead and download that instant support client and go ahead and save it to my system. Then, of course, Windows Defender will not allow you to run that program directly, so you'll go ahead and click on More Info here and say Run Anyway. Then the user account control will come up. Since this program requires privilege, you'll click on Yes. When the remotely screen pops up, you'll be given a session ID, and that session ID is something you're going to provide to the remotely administrator in order for them to remotely control your session with remotely. So back on my Linux screen, I've gone ahead and gone to remotely.scotti-BYTE.com also, and I've signed in with my username, password, and my two-factor authentication key. Next, I want to click on the Remote Control tab on the left-hand side of the screen. When this comes up, it will prompt me for session ID, and as we've noticed previously, the session ID was 644403852, and then I click Connect. And then it says that it is requesting remote control. On the Windows side, it will say you've received a connection request from this particular user. Would you like to accept? And I go ahead and say yes. And now my session is being remote controlled. In order to install the resident client on the Windows side, I would have to, as an administrator, log on to my remotely over there. In order to do that, I'm going to log in and authenticate through my Bitwarden. And once I've done the login and provided my two-factor authentication, at that point I can go ahead and add a client for that, and I do that by going to the download section, and then I select the Windows installer. That goes ahead and downloads to my local system, and then I should be able to go to my file manager, go to downloads, and then execute the remotely installer, say more info, tell it to run anyway, answer the user account control prompt, and it will ask me where it wants to go, and the server URL, of course, in my case is going to be remotely.scotti-BYTE.com because I downloaded the client from my server, so it knows where to connect to my server, and it has all that other information. So I'll go ahead and say install. It downloads the agent and performs the installation. At this point, I can go ahead and close the installation. I'll go ahead and close the file manager, and I don't need the remotely web session any longer, so I'll go ahead and close it. Now when I return back to the home screen of my remotely web page, you can see here that the resident client that I installed on that Windows 11 machine shows up here. If I go ahead and click on it, it gives me an actions option, and I'll say that I want to remote control that system. And so it says starting remote control, and it goes ahead and brings up a window that allows me to remote control the system. And then in the bottom of the screen, it says for the remote user, remote control is active. A remote control session has started. So this remote control session is in a tab of my web browser, and I can come up here to my web browser and choose the option to go full screen. And once I do that, it looks like any other session, and your fonts and so on are proportionally spaced, so everything looks pretty good. And then of course, to get out of it, you can bump into the top of the screen, hit the X, and you'll go back into your web browser. To discontinue the remote control session, I can go ahead and click the X up here, and it will come back here to the main screen. And if I go over to my remote system, the remote system no longer has the sign at the bottom saying that it is being remote controlled, indicating that I have disconnected from it. Here I am on my command line of my LXD server, and I'm going to create a LXD container in order to install remotely. You could also install remotely on a Docker container in a Docker server, and I'm going to install it in a Docker container inside of a LXD container because I find that to be a really great best practice. So here we have a LXC launch, Ubuntu :2204 remotely, and I have -- profile equals default and profile bridge profile. If you haven't seen my video that is entitled LXD Step by Step, that's where we talk about the bridge profile and setting up LXD in general. And then we have a switch called boot.autostart equals to true, which means that every time the LXD server starts, it will start this remotely container at the same time. Then we have another switch called security.nesting equals to true, and that's what allows us to nest Docker inside of a LXD container. And then we have limits.cpu.allowance equals to 20%. And that means that we have our CPU capped at 20%. It means it can use no more than 20%, but does not mean that it will use 20%. And finally, limits.memory set at 4 gigabytes, which means it can use up to 4 gigabytes of memory. Now that the container's been started, I can do a LXC list. And you notice that it has an address on my main LAN, which is 172.16.1.62, and that's in virtue of having added the bridge profile to this container. Now I can go ahead and connect to my container with the LXC shell remotely. Once I've connected there, I want to do an apt update, && apt upgrade -y, and that will go ahead and install all the latest updates for that particular operating system container instance. Now I'm going to create myself a user account with an add user Scott. Go ahead and give Scott a password and finish out all the other prompts here. And then I'm going to do a user mod -a G sudo Scott, putting Scott in the sudo group. And then I'll do an su -Scott, which moves over to the Scott account, and the dash makes sure that I move over to the Scott home directory as well. So if I do a pwd over here, you can see I'm in /home/Scott. The next thing that we want to do is we want to install Docker, since remotely is a Docker app, and we do that by running the script at the Docker website. We're going to include all of these in the show notes, but I provide my password and it goes off and installs Docker. Now that Docker's installed, I installed Docker Compose with a sudo apt install docker-compose. At this point, if I do a docker ps command, I'm going to get an error message indicating that I don't have privilege to access the Docker daemon. In order to fix that, we're going to do a sudo usermod -a G docker Scott, adding Scott to the Docker group. In order to make that take effect, I'm going to do a new grp Docker, and then I'll type groups, and we are in the Docker group and also the sudo group. So now if I do a docker ps, I'm able to run Docker without having to use the sudo command. As a best practice to keep my Docker application sorted out, I like to do a make dir on remotely, which is the name of the application, and then I cd into the remotely folder, and then I do a nano docker -compose.yml, and into that we paste our code for the YAML file for Docker or for remotely. And the remotely is pretty simple. The only thing to note here is basically that we have a address here, or port number of 80 that is being used. And the reason I'm using port 80 is simply because I can easily expose that on my LXD container since no other ports are being used. I do a Control O and hit enter to write the file out, and a Control X to exit the nano editor. At this point, I do a Docker space compose space up -D. Now that the application's been started, I can do a Docker space compose space PS, and here you can see that we have remotely up and running. Now I did an IP space A command, and I can see that the IP address for this particular instance is, or the LXD container I should say, is at 172.16.1.62. So now all it's left to do is launch my web browser and go to 172.16.1.62. I hit enter, and there is our instance of remotely. Since this is a brand new install of remotely, I have the register button here. I click register, and then I type in my email. And I type in a password that I want to use, hopefully something fairly complex. And I click on register. And it comes back up here and gives me this screen that you saw earlier. If I log out, I no longer have the register button, I only have the login button. If you're going to use remotely from outside of your network, you need to have a domain name associated with it. So my production remotely is at remotely.scotti-BYTE.com, which is a subdomain that I defined over on my domain name service provider. Once I have that name, then my scheme for Nginx Proxy Manager is going to be HTTP. I would enter the address of wherever that system is inside of your network. I use port number 80 because that's what I set up in the Docker compose file. I set up block exploits and WebSockets to be on as well, and go over to SSL and I assign a new certificate. In this case, it assigned the certificate for the subdomain name remotely.scotti-BYTE.com. I've also enabled Force SSL and HTTP to support. And once I do that, I go ahead and click save, and that makes my instance accessible from outside my network at remotely.scotti-BYTE.com. So in summary, Remotely has both one-off remote control sessions using their portable instant support clients, and they also feature remote management, including scripting with their resident agents. Remotely supports organizations and device groups where specified users can manage workstations that are within specified groups. And Remotely is entirely web-based, unlike RustDesk, and that may be attractive to some users. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.